Thank you, Simon, for those very kind words. I always say that when I hear stuff like that, if my parents were in the room, my father would be proud, but my mother would actually believe every single word of what you've just said. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in this very important seminar. I can't overstate the importance that NDN has been playing in the debate over both the growing need to politically empower and successfully integrate Latinos into the fabric of American society, and because of that and the changing demographics and politics that will accompany this tectonic sea change that is occurring in American society, the importance of the relationship between the United States and the rest of the hemisphere. The inter-American relations, which are so critically important, despite some of the pundits that were questioning whether President Obama should have canceled or postponed or shortened his trip to Latin America because of Libya, I don't see why he should have at any point have considered doing that. I think the relationship with the hemisphere, regardless of the other issues that clutter the president's or the White House's radar screen, whether it's Iraq or the Middle East or North Africa, Korea, potentially North Korea, the relationship with the Americas is critically important. I don't think I have to remind this group that many years ago when Henry Kissinger, I never remember if he was then Secretary of State or whether he was National Security Advisor to the President, but when he was asked about the geostrategic importance of Latin America to the United States, quipped that Latin America was a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica, meaning that the relevance of Latin America to the geostrategic design of the hemisphere was negligible, to say the least. I'm not suggesting today that Latin America is geostrategically a threat or a challenge to the United States, but I do think that many of the things that are taking place in our hemisphere, whether it's trade, whether it's the fight against organized crime, whether it's the role several nations are playing with new alternative means of generating energy, whether it's how we are looking at the world from a very different perspective, I think this relationship is critically important. And I want to underscore our recognition and the importance of the work that NDN and Simon and his team and his staff have been playing in putting this, in underscoring the importance of understanding what is going on demographically and politically within the United States itself, and the importance of the relationship with the hemisphere as a whole. I was asked to speak about one of the most important aspects of our bilateral cooperation with this administration, and which has fundamentally changed the dynamic of our two-way relationship, which is a concept paper, a statement that was put out by both presidents, President Obama, President Calderon, during the state visit of President Calderon to Washington in May of last year. And it's the 21st Century Border Declaration. For those of you interested, there are a host of places. I see Andrew Seeley here of the Mexico Institute of the Woodrow Wilson that's doing a terrific job in Washington, D.C. But I'm sure that Andrew on his webpage, NDN, we have it on our webpage, the statement and the declaration that both presidents put out there is there. You can consult it there. And I'm going to talk about this because I think it encompasses the two most important buzzwords of this relationship today. On the one hand, a bilateral relationship that has become truly strategic, and on the other, a bilateral relationship that has become truly intimistic. And I'll talk about these two issues as I flush some of my initial remarks. And you want me to wrap up by 1:15?
No, you got a little bit more time.
Okay. I'll try and be quick so I don't bump the rest of the panels further down in the afternoon. Let me start with why the relationship is strategic and how the 21st century border vision fits into this strategic concept. Let me start by reminding some of you who follow U.S.-Mexico issues or U.S. or Mexico foreign policy carefully, many years ago, decades ago, I'll name the sin but not the sinner, a then sitting Mexican president went to Singapore to meet Premier Lee Kuan Yew on what was the first trip a Mexican president had ever made to Singapore. And they sit down, and in the usual chit-chat that accompanies formal diplomatic meetings, Premier Lee Kuan Yew asks this Mexican president, "Mr. President, remind me, how many kilometers of a border does Mexico share with the United States?" And this Mexican president responded, Unfortunately, 3,000 kilometers. Lee Kuan Yew sort of stayed silent for about 10 seconds, scratched his head, and looked at this Mexican president and said, "Mr. President, what would Singapore give for 1 kilometer of a border with the United States?" What this Mexican president said 25 plus years ago, A, would never be said by any serious, responsible Mexican public official or president or politician today. And A, that's a sign of how much the relationship has changed. And B, did not take into account what precisely the 21st Century Border Vision is trying to do, which is to understand the huge synergies and opportunities that exist because of this 3,000 kilometer border, 2,000 mile border that both countries share. And if you look at how the border has played a role in the creation of this strategic relationship, you just have to look at trade and the role that trade has played in changing the face and the nature of this bilateral relationship. Since NAFTA's implementation in 1994, more than 40 million new additional jobs had, and I say had because obviously 2009 threw a spanner in the works, but it wasn't because of NAFTA, it wasn't because of Mexico, it was a crisis that was born and created here. But certainly until 1994, 40 million new additional jobs had been created in the North American economies. Now, this is too much of a sophisticated crowd for me to come and say that every single one of those 40 million jobs was the direct result of NAFTA. But what I think we can fairly say is that the famous Ross Perot sucking sound of jobs never materialized because of NAFTA. 40 million new additional jobs. Annual trade among NAFTA partners now totals $946 billion, more than triple what it was in 1993. U.S. exports to Mexico have risen 221.2%. Mexican exports to the U.S. have grown 364%, and Mexican exports to Canada have grown 641.1%. And actually, Simon, it's slightly different and depends on where your orientation and your focus is. If you're focused on traditional transatlantic ties with Western Europe, Mexico buys more U.S. goods than the combined purchases of Germany, France, Great Britain, and Italy. If you're focused south, Mexico buys more U.S. goods than all the rest of Latin America put together. And if you're focused east towards the Pacific, Mexico buys more than what Japan and China together buy from the United States. Regardless of all the ballyhoo over China these days, for every dollar that China is buying from the United States, Mexico and Canada together are buying $9 of American exports. We are your second largest buyer of exports on the face of the earth, and we have become the second largest trading partner of the United States these last 3 trimesters because of the surge that we have seen in Mexico's economy coming off the effects of the 2009 recession. So, you know, if you look at some of these trade numbers, I think there's an impressive story to be told as to how NAFTA has changed the dynamics of our bilateral relationship and why we are doing what I will explain in a few minutes regarding the 21st Century Border Declaration and Vision. Moreover, if you look at 2 other additional, I think, factors that explain Mexico's strategic role for the United States. One is that in the new World Bank Doing Business report, Mexico ranked 35, the highest in Latin America, with Chile in place number 43, Brazil in place 127, and Argentina in place 115. So Mexico is clearly moving forward in terms of its competitiveness and its ability to attract businesses. But more importantly, a story that is seldom understood and talked about in the United States, and which is probably the most important success story that you see in Mexico today, the expansion of the Mexican middle classes. A combined effect of Mexico's mooring into the international economy via trade and via NAFTA. We are the country, I think, along with Chile, that has the largest number of free trade agreements on the face of the earth. We just ratified the upgrade with our free trade agreement with Colombia, and therefore, given that I'm in view of the capital here, I'll use this as an infomercial to underscore why it is so geostrategically important for the US Congress to follow suit and ratify Panama and Colombia as soon as possible. But the expansion of the middle classes that has occurred because of the mooring of Mexico's economy in the international global arena through the free trade agreements, B, through sensible, sustained macroeconomic policies that have been put in place since the last economic crisis that we were responsible for, 1994, plus what is probably today the most important extreme poverty alleviation program on the face of the earth, a program on which Bolsa Familia in Brazil is now modeled on, Oportunidades, which through conditional cash transfers to the female head of household has brought approximately 40 million people out of extreme poverty in Mexico. These three factors put together have expanded a middle class in Mexico. And it is no surprise, and this is not an infomercial for the companies that I will, or for the company that I will mention here, but it is no surprise, and it's not rocket science, that Walmart has the largest chain of stores outside the United States today in Mexico. And so this is completely changing the dynamics of our two-way relationship. And this is where the 21st century border plays a very important role. Because the 21st century border seeks to understand the challenges of the bilateral relationship and to propel a vision where we won't have common security unless we can also trigger common prosperity. Understanding that on the border, you have to deal with the issues related to security simply because of the impact of 9/11 and the impact that 9/11 has had on border security issues and on the bilateral relationship per se. For anyone who does not understand that a threat to the security of the United States or a perception of threat to the security of the United States that materializes across our common border will have a very profound effect on this relationship that we have been building with the United States. So the challenge that we had as we devised the 21st century border vision was how did we, at the same time as we thickened border security, as we strengthened border security, ensure that this trade that I have just mentioned, this two-way trade that has propelled the economies of both our nations, does not sputter. That as we seek to enhance our ability to stop potential terrorists or transnational organized crime from plying their trade in one direction and guns and cash going in the other direction, we don't clamp down on this huge two-way trade of approximately 1 million legal crossings per day and 75,000 trucks that on any given day reach our border in both directions. So as we enhance our ability to ensure security on both sides of the border, we also need to make sure that we are putting into place policies that provide for trade facilitation and that deliver the border infrastructure that we need to be able to continue to compete. So it's common security and common prosperity and how we bind these two issues together. This is why, as we have moved forward with the Obama administration, we have been working on 5 strategic drivers to propel the relationship forward, 4 of which fit perfectly into the 21st century border vision. The first one, no surprises, security. Not only how we take on drugs and thugs, how we prevent our border from being used by potential terrorists who want to undermine the national security of Mexico or the United States, but also how do we tackle some of the new threats like pandemics. And I think the efforts and the work that Mexico and the United States did together in 2009 to confront and contain H1N1 was very powerful proof of how our two countries are thinking outside the box. Back in 2005, both countries, in the face of avian flu and SARS in Asia, very quickly figured out that at some point our two countries were going to be faced with some type of outburst like this one, whether it was avian or SARS coming across the ocean into North America or something that had developed here. And in 2005, we started working together to develop protocols to take on challenges like this one. We started devising a roadmap. We started devising how we would need to address the issue, which authorities needed to start training and working together. And it is this architecture that we started building in 2005 that allowed both countries to very quickly address the challenges of H1N1 in 2009, to transparently, quickly, effectively inform our societies of what was going on, identify the strain of the virus, contain the virus, and shut it down. The second strategic driver is border infrastructure and trade facilitation, something that I've already mentioned. How do we continue to ensure that we have the border infrastructure to continue to compete and to grow? And a lot of you that I see around this table have heard me saying this, but I still find it very powerful to underscore. Last year, Mexico and the United States inaugurated 3 new ports of entry across our common border. They're the first 3 new ports of entry that have been built and inaugurated on our common border in more than a decade. And we are now waiting for clearance for the development of 2 new railroad crossings along our border. These 2 railroad crossings, when built, will be the first railroad crossings that have been built on our common border since the Mexican Revolution in 1910. This is the border infrastructure that we had basically 100 years ago, and a border infrastructure that we have to pull up from the bootstraps. So how do we develop a much more modern but also secure border infrastructure that can allow us to do non-intrusive inspections of cargo and conveyances, of how we can ensure that we have customs pre-clearance systems, of how we can enhance business people coming across the border, and this is why Global Entry, a program in which Mexico is now a full participant as of a few months ago, is so critically important, and why trucking and solving trucking was such an important piece of the equation. I couldn't listen to all of Ambassador Shapiro's remarks. I arrived almost at the end, but I don't know if she talked about the issue of trucking and why it was so critically important that our 2 administrations get this issue of U.S. non-compliance for more than 17 years on trucking resolved. And it is all about how do we continue to enhance the ability of North America to compete. So how do we enhance, modernize this border infrastructure? The third strategic prong is how do we take on energy efficiency and energy security and the safe exploitation of resources in the Gulf of Mexico. This is an issue that obviously we have been working on because of the effects of Deepwater Horizon. As you know well, Mexico has most of its significant oil extraction facilities in the Gulf of Mexico. So as we learn from the experiences of Deepwater Horizon, as we seek to enhance our ability to provide new alternative means of energy in the North American market, as we seek to deepen our ability to provide energy efficiency in North America, this is a critical component of our dialogue, and one that also has to be factored in as to how we understand the dynamics on both sides of our common border. The fourth strategic driver, and these are the 4 drivers that I think are prescient for the 21st century border vision, is how do we continue to trigger economic growth and social well-being, not only through labor mobility written large, that is both the ability of companies to hire the best and the brightest in Canada, in Mexico, or the United States, irrespectively, or how do we deal with a very challenging issue of undocumented immigration and the need for us to reconcile what is a conundrum on the border, where on the one hand you have a sign that says help wanted, and on the other hand you have a sign saying no trespassing. And how we have to take into account that we have a labor-abundant country living next to a capital-abundant country, and how do we trigger synergies that will allow both countries to continue to grow and to compete on the global arena, and understanding that at the end of the day, there's no more important asset for North America than our human capital, and how we bind that into what we are doing across the border. These 4 prongs, and I'll mention the 5th one in passing, but I don't want to dwell on that one because it's not relevant to this discussion on the 21st century border vision. These 4 prongs are fundamental pieces of the 21st century border, because what we're doing is, for the first time in the history of the relationship with the United States, we have one holistic vision for border management. We have eliminated the old stovepipe system in which each one of these issues was dealt with in a separate bin, and there was no connection or no connectivity between the different issues that were critical to understanding the border and the dynamics on the border. What this concept and this vision and the articulation of these policies is doing is it is ensuring that as we move forward on security, we're also moving forward on trade facilitation. As we move forward on how do we trigger economic growth and well-being on the border, we're also tackling environmental degradation on the border. How do we deal with critical issues like water? How do we deal with migratory species going back and forth across our common border? This is the first time in the bilateral relationship that we have a common, unified, articulated vision of dealing with the challenges on the border. The fifth prong that I will just mention in passing is how do Mexico and the United States continue to deepen the footprint of their engagement and dialogue on global and regional issues. This is a critically important issue for me, for the Mexican government. It is one in which I am convinced that as we deepen the conversation, the discussion on foreign policy, regional, global issues on which Mexico and the United States have common concerns, common interests. Iran, how we worked successfully with Mexican stewardship in the UN Security Council last year to send an equivocal message to Iran that it needed to comply with its obligations for the Pacific use of nuclear energy. This is a very important component of our dialogue, but it's obviously less relevant to the 21st century border vision that we are working together. The second buzzword that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks is that this is an intermestic relationship. And I'm stealing a concept from Bayless Manning, who many of you know was president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and in the 70s, late 70s, I think, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs coining this phrase of intermestic. And what he wanted to try and explain was that there were certain issues in certain countries where the distinction between foreign policy and domestic policy was blurring, where the foreign policy issues of one country became domestic policies for the other, and the domestic policies of one became the foreign policy issues of the other. Today, I think if there's one country on the face of the earth that is truly witness to the intermesticity of the relationship, it's the US-Mexico relationship. Every single issue of the US-Mexico bilateral agenda, whether it's how we fight transnational organized crime operating on both sides of the border, whether it's labor issues, whether it's trade, whether it's border infrastructure, whether it's water, whether it's energy, whether it's green jobs, any and every single one of these issues has very powerful domestic roots, constituencies, and actors in both countries on both sides of the border. And for the foreign policy agenda of both countries, for the bilateral relationship to move forward, we need to tackle these domestic constituencies and politics. And only sometimes by cutting through the Gordian knots of parochialism and domestic constituencies can we make sure that we can move this agenda forward. And this is why sometimes, despite what I have said, and some of you, I see some of my Mexican reporter friends here in the room, many of you are saying, well, you know, probably the ambassador has been drinking too much Kool-Aid because not everything is rosy and peachy. Of course, not everything is rosy and peachy in this bilateral relationship, simply because of how complex and how diverse this relationship is. But I can say two things. One is that we have been extremely able to compartmentalize and prevent contamination of the agenda as a whole by disputes or disagreements in specific issues of the agenda. And two, that the muscle tone and the strategic direction that we have today in the US-Mexico bilateral relationship is probably unheard of since the days in which we decided to negotiate NAFTA. We are in many ways facing sort of a Dickensian tale of two cities. The formal diplomatic relationship between both countries and the direction of this relationship is uniquely strong, but public perceptions on both sides of the border, for different reasons and different motivations, in the US because of issues related to perceptions of insecurity on the border or issues related to how polarizing immigration has become as a national debate in the United States. In Mexico, because of the issue of guns and because of what is growing as a sense of in Mexican public opinion of the need of the United States to do more to stem the flow of guns and the flow of cash bulk cash into Mexico. So public perception on both sides of the border would seem to suggest that this is the worst of times in the bilateral relationship, whereas if you actually look at what is going on the ground between both governments and both executives, and I'd say between border governors and state assemblies and mayors, the muscle tone of the relationship is uniquely strong. What this 21st century border, I think, will do is take into account these two buzzwords. It is intermestic, and that is why we have devised this holistic vision for border management, in which we're putting all the different issues together and moving them forward together, but also the strategic direction of the relationship. And I do think that if you look down the road, the 21st century border vision, which we will, by the way, have a working group meeting next week in Washington, D.C., to continue moving the 21st century border vision forward, to continue benchmarking the next steps from here until 2012, when both administrations will, well, at least mine will end and this one will end its first term. We don't know what will happen, obviously, but as both administrations head to 2012, we will seek to put out those benchmarks so that this border vision that we have developed can continue to move and can continue to change the dynamics that occur on the border between our two nations. The border is the spark plug of the relationship. As the border goes, so does the general bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States. And a lot of the dynamics that we see there, despite the challenges that we see regarding security as it relates to organized crime, or regarding the challenge of undocumented flows of migrants across that border, the dynamics that you see on the border today, whether it's in the interaction between border governors, border mayors, between civil society and NGOs on both sides of the border, is, I think, very promising. And I am convinced that this border vision that we have put out there together, both Mexico and the United States, under the leadership of both our presidents, will continue to build upon this very different way of understanding how the border fits into the larger equation of our bilateral relationship. Thank you very much.